it's 2:30. Sebastian,
Okay.
welcome once again. I won't introduce you now. Entire public knows you. Anyways, they know you. They knew you before this webinar series also. So please go ahead and share. And this time you have promised to be more interactive. So I will read questions for you, whatever comes on YouTube, for your help.
Yeah.
Professor Sanjay, I have shared my query earlier by email. I hope you have received it.
Yes, yes.
Just resend it once again. I had received a few days ago, hopefully, but you can send it once again.
Yeah. So let me start without much ado. And, so this is the second, interaction that I'm having with many of you all. The first was titled, the deepening crisis of the Indian economy in the wake of the COVID challenges. And therein we talked about, what could happen. And I was pretty pessimistic in saying that we have probably, reached a point where unless very strong actions are taken, there would be permanent damage done to the economy. Okay. So subsequently, of course, the government came out with a very large, seemingly large, 20 lakh crore, fiscal stimulus. Let me not say fiscal stimulus, but stimulus. And it was unraveled over 3 days of 3 afternoons of presentation by the finance minister, which was very well and comprehensively done. So what I'll do is I'll review these, this entire package quickly, and then get on to an interpretation and a statement of what could be done. Okay, would expect perhaps. Okay, so let me first recall. Okay, before that, I'll speak only for 30 minutes, and after that, I'll pick questions which Sanjay will pass on to me. Okay, so let me start by very briefly reviewing the presentation last time. So we argued that the decline is bound to be steep. Most sectors are on a free fall, particularly those with a huge multiplier effect, such as automobiles. Okay, revival is being hampered hugely by the continuing lockouts. Okay, the problem of migrant labor was simply not anticipated, and the option of using an urban employment renewal or guarantee fund to keep them in the urban, in the industrial places was missed. As a result, there has been complete chaos with regard to the migrant labor, and today they are in between. They're somewhere on the way back to home, and perhaps some of them are already on the way back to industry. So capacity losses are going to be significant if we can't really restart fully, let's say in a month's time. Lockdown benefits were completely frittered away by a ham-handed administration, which could not kind of functionally interpret it. Instead, it was purely territorial in operation. And then, of course, restrictions and administrative measures, they don't seem to recognize the limits of any kind of pure territorial measures, which don't recognize the interlinkages. We brought out the need for a fairly significant fiscal stimulus of around 2.5% of GDP, minimally. Now I had revised that actually. Okay, brought out the need for monetary measures, and particularly monetary measures which are in keeping with the situation of very high uncertainty in the financial markets, which is there universally, but it had been compounded by the past in India, the period before the crisis, which would mean that today the central banker has to do a lot more OMOs, direct purchases, that is open market operations, and not just pretend that the banks will do it, and also do direct purchases of credit of the stock as well as the bonds of a large number of financial companies and perhaps even some of the productive enterprises. In other words, the RBI needs to expand its own balance sheet rather significantly, and it has to feed the liquidity, because the only way to bring down the uncertainty is to actually feed the monster with liquidity. It is not inflationary because it's not a conventional situation. That many economists even refuse to understand. Okay. Subsequently, of course, the government announced a slew of measures which were made, which were done in about 3 tranches. Okay. Now you can see, how important the understanding of doing the correct liquidity measures are. What I'll do is I'll share a screen which is essentially a table from the CMI. And remember, the CMI has been bringing out wonderful analysis and bits of information, tables and so on, which for any rational economist, you should be able to make sense of and see. So let me just share a screen, which should be self-revealing in terms of the liquidity. Okay, yeah. So here it is. So, yeah. So here it is. This is a straight, cut and paste from CMI's website, which brings out, what has actually happened in the LTROs and all the other measures which the RBI was doing. They're not going to work because the entire money came back in the reverse repo back into the coffers of the central bank. So that's inevitably going to happen, not just because we have a public sector banking system, but any bank would do that in this situation of extreme high uncertainty, because there is a value in combining a whole lot of measures together, because then it gives the confidence. First of all, then it becomes more workable, and secondly, it gives the confidence to people that look, there is something seriously intended and there is a strategic intent. Okay, so what happened is a kind of stopgap measure. So most of these measures did not amount to, and as you can see, the net credit disbursals by scheduled commercial banks has fallen, but more importantly, the average turnover in the reverse repo, which is the money coming back, has gone through the roof. Okay, and let me also share something which became available now. Here you can see the e-way bills generated by the GSTN. Okay, and the latest data right on their website shows that there has been a complete collapse. And this is not difficult for anyone to understand, given the lockdown. Very little e-way bills would have been generated. Now, this is quite stunning, because a lockdown doesn't mean that transactions should not have happened. Okay, a lockdown doesn't mean that all factories shut. Okay, I mean, to shut a chemical factory is a disaster. Okay, so yeah, so these are some of the things which we need to look at. So now let me go on to the slew of measures which were brought out by the government over those, and let me review them. Now, you have all heard them over the TV and so on. So I'll not be I won't spend too much time on it, except to make my comments. Okay, so let me go back to the PPT and share that with you. Okay, yeah. So yeah. So now I suppose you can see this. This is day one of the finance minister's presentation. So there is a collateral free loan of 3 lakh crores. I think this is a great idea, and this was done very well. And it gives something like 30,000 crores to everyone, to all the MSMEs potentially. About 45 lakh units could benefit. 4,000 crores of offer guarantee and so on. So the two put together would mean that about 32,000 crores of credit would go, and the government probably has an expenditure of around 4,000 crores. Okay. Now, definition of MSMEs changed. Now, this is good. This is a good measure, but it's kind of neutral to the current situation. Okay. The first 3 measures where actually credit is going to go is good. However, whether or not this much credit would go is it depends on the situation of demand, and whatever else, So that's where the complementarity comes in, and one hopes that it will come soon. So government procurement of tenders, localizing all tenders below 200 crores by government. This can be done by the government. It's a good measure, okay, and one can't quibble about it. It's nice, and it's required in these days. I mean, you may call it protectionist, but I think it's a nice measure because it keeps the extremely competitive Chinese and others, out from these 200 crore procurement. Gives a lot of space to Indian IT and other companies, etc. So trade fairs, e-market linkage to address receivables of GOI, PSU, and state governments is also fine, given that it can shorten the delay with which the payments are received. One hopes that these delays are not there, that all governments become kind of model paymasters and pay all their clients. However, that is not the case, and therefore a kind of administrative measure to now speed it up, it looks good. So EPF contribution by the government has been enhanced. The details, I won't go into it. So essentially, it means a government expenditure of around 2,500 crores. Okay, NBFCs will have a 30,000 crore special liquidity for primary and secondary purchase of debt. This, I think, is very good, and it needs to be coordinated with the RBI on how this would be done. Okay, and essentially, if that money goes to actually purchase the debt and the paper from the investment grade as well as the non-investment grade, NBFCs, it would be a great thing. However, it does create a moral hazard, and that's where it will take time unfolding, and that is inevitable. So one can't again be too critical about it. Okay, Discom's cash flows, 90,000 crores of injection through the PFC, RF, REC, and so on, guarantee by the state CPUs to give a rebate, etc. Now this is pushing the problem under the carpet, because the problem of all the Discoms is quite clear cut, that you don't have a direct subsidy scheme in agriculture, and if the direct subsidy scheme comes, I think all the Discoms can become okay and so on. So that's not there. But anyway, be that as it may, that's really structural reform. Giving this liquidity is important, because otherwise, there is a payments crisis down the line. And again, I would think this is important. Okay? Now, all government, all GOI and its parastatals like railways, NHAI, and so on, they would release payment to their contractors and hold back the bank guarantees only in a limited sort of way. Now, this is like saying, that look, I used to pay you all the time, but I'm not going to pay you now. Okay. Now, similarly, TDS, TCS, deductions, the good measures, especially if you start from the premise that government is a dada and will grab the tax upfront. So it's a good measure in that sense. Now, many of these have moral hazard. For instance, a real estate measure to delay the registrations would be realistic, but it does have a moral hazard unless there is a pullback. Okay, GST rate extended, again, there's a moral hazard there. It's not a great measure to do it. Don't move around with rates. Don't move around with accounting practices. These are all well known, but well, the government has chosen to done that. GST refunds to be speeded up. Yes, it should be. I mean, the first question one would ask is, why wasn't it speeded up, COVID or no COVID? So that's first day's presentation. Okay, second day's is again important. Liquidity support for farmers through the NABARD, RIDF, etc. Roughly amounting to about 86,000 crores is my guess. Good measure. Okay, in shelter, 3 meals provided for migrants, 20,000 SHGs, Paisa portal and all that. Good measure, but more administrative, more institutional development. State disaster relief fund of 11,000 crores. Hopefully the states would quickly go ahead and spend it. They have no problems actually spending, so one would assume that they'll spend it. The NREGS wage rates were raised, but this was done a bit before the COVID crisis. But whatever it is, it results in an expenditure. And government has now provided for 10,000 crores of additional allocation. Okay, now it may have to be much more than this. Okay, soon enough, I think, just as I made the PPT, the number of people seeking the NREGs has gone up, which she herself mentioned, the finance minister herself. Now, universal floor to minimum wage, nice, good, okay, yeah. ESIC amendment to include all units, again, good. Reskilling of retrenched workers, good. But what about the institutional mechanism to really do this? Government of India, in a kind of organizational sense, has always been very weak. So, it will take years and days and months before anything materializes. Free food grains for migrant workers, it's a pittance actually, 3,500 crores. As many have said, it's possible to increase it, at least 50 times, if not more. Portability of PDS, okay. Mudra Shishu loan, some 1,500, interest subvention, not a bad measure, 1,500 crores. Special credit for street vendors, housing incentives for lower middle class, lower of the middle class, etc. Campa funds, what are Campa funds? These are compensatory afforestation and employment creation funds. Now, what is completely ridiculous is that something close to 47,000 crores had accumulated in the Campa accounts. These are monies given by industrialists and others, who, when they build projects which take away forest land, they give compensation for that forest land. So as much as nearly 50,000 crores has been lying, but they were not allocated to the states, and there was no plan to spend them. Now there is a statement that we will do so. Okay. Now this is interesting. Hopefully, let us hope that they'll do so, or let us hope that NGOs and others will put pressure on the government to do so. Okay. this will greatly benefit tribals and other SC/STs and so on in the fringes. Okay, but that it was not done is almost a crime. I mean, and, my NGO friends tell me that, look, there's very little on the ground that has happened. But over the last 1 year, something has moved, and that I think is good. So the government is seriously intends this, and one hopes that it will be pushed. Okay, so farmers emergency fund through NABARD, Kisan credit, for fishermen and others, subsidy credit, for housing. Now these are all credit measures. Now when you compute the subsidy equivalent in the housing, it comes to about 1,400 crores. Yeah. Okay. Now on the third day, she came out again with a fair amount of announcements. One was an agri-infra funds, a corpus for FPOs, cooperatives, and so on for infrastructure development at the farm gate. That means in and around the farming operations. That means after post-harvest, supporting food and agri-business and startup of micro enterprises. Screen, slideshow. Yeah, slideshow. Yeah, so so that's good, but it's credit measure, and since agriculture is not going to get that badly affected, I think this would have some significance. Okay, supporting food and agri businesses and micro startups. Well, 2 lakh crores, something out there in the form of expenditure. Fishermen, for them to double the exports. 20,000 crores of actual spending to be allocated. I think this will be spent, but it will take some time over that. It could double the exports, and I think that's possible easily. Foot and mouth disease programs for 13 crore cattle. Now, this should have been done a long time ago. Foot and mouth disease we could have abolished, but be that as it may, now the government is very serious and it essentially intends vaccinating everybody. Traceability of cattle, and animal husbandry exports. Some credit is being provided of 15,000 crores. Remember, it's a credit. Then, of course, honeybees and Operation Greens and essential commodities and so on. Okay, and standard price to allow. Now let me talk a bit about this central law to not ban interstate movement of crops and produce, etc., where farmers can go beyond the APMC. Modifications to the Essential Commodities Act of 1955, and these two, I think they're extremely significant and they are positive. Okay, Indian farmers have been badly screwed up by the APMC. The agricultural produce marketing cooperatives were originally farmers' cooperatives, and the idea was that farmers would realize a lot more value bypassing the trade. But over a period, traders kind of became the main influencers or owners actually, or participants in this APMCs. And many of them had even bone-breaking powers, and they would prevent farmers from directly accessing places, urban places. So it's a good thing that Congress government tried to stop this and did that, but they couldn't go beyond a certain point. The BJP government has been trying to break the monopoly of the APMC. Some states have kind of on paper abolished it, but I think it's a good idea to explicitly allow farmers, and the COVID kind of provides a kind of an opportunity to let the farmers walk into the cities and start their vending, okay, particularly of fruits, vegetables, and that sort of thing. Okay, I think modifications to the Essential Commodities Act is also very important, because what happened under this act is the government, in the sense of the civil servant, was ever ready to intervene and kind of randomly ad hoc, I won't say randomly, but ad hoc come out with bans on important crops like onions, tomatoes, potatoes, and so on, so that the farmer never really got the upside. Okay, hopefully this would go all the way to getting the upside. Okay, but knowing the limitations of any government which is so very middle class oriented, I would be very happy if this kind of a modification can go beyond the COVID. Okay, or that the modifications are substantial enough. There are exceptions which are provided. One has not seen the details of the provisions. Okay, it would be wonderful for the farmers if this can actually be done. That there is nothing like an essential commodities, and only government in a really difficult situation uses its danda to move food and other things. Okay, and whatever intervention government wants to do, it doesn't do it through administration. it must be done, but it does it through NDDB-like approach, which is what we call a market intervention operation rather than administrative measures. So I think that's extremely important. And I think, so you have a mix of all of it, but whether or not it will lift the economy from the crisis, which requires massive demand side boost, that's a moot question. Now, there's a 65,000 crores in my estimates, most have estimated lower, of expenditures which will be spread over quite a while. It's not immediate. Okay. And so that's what is relevant. These credit measures are highly contingent. Unless the demand, unless there is a pickup, these credit measures are not going to go. But they are like, opening the door and waiting, to welcome the guests. So now let me take a view on what this would result in terms of the growth. Okay. Before that, let me just go through a simulation exercise which I had done by using a complex simple multiplier model. It's in the books, it's called the simple multiplier model, but essentially what one would say is a Keynesian type demand side model with multiple multipliers. And when you do that, okay, with no COVID, if I take 1920 data and move what I call the base import, that means the import functions one parameter to 3% above, and similarly government expenditure to 8% above its 1920 value. These are all, some of them are budgeted and I'm picking up from there. Exports to 3%, which is what was realistic in the pre-COVID crisis. NFI, that means net foreign income from abroad, to be 5% above, remittances to be 5% above, investments to be about 3% above the current, above the 1920 levels. Then I get a growth of around 4.82, and my sense is a growth of around 4.5, about 5, up to between 4.5 and 5 was what was anticipated by most people. That kind of calibrates the model. Okay. Now, if I work on a modest impact basis, okay, where let us say the exports fall by about 85 plus 3, that's about 88%. And similarly, the base import in sync also falls. The remittances fall, as well as the foreign income, net foreign income, which is actually negative, that itself falls, because then foreigners also don't make money in India and they kind of restrict that. The investments continue to remain 1.03 because the government pushes and is ready to keep the investment up. Then the growth rate actually falls to about 2.14%. So what it means is that there is a shrinkage if there is only a modest impact. This is what I had worked on for my first paper on, that where I argued that a 2.5% fiscal deficit kind of thing would be required. Actually, it was a little bit more than this. Now, a significant impact, okay, gives rise to about a fall in about 13% in terms of real GDP and nominal GDP of around 8.4. I've assumed the inflation rate to be the same. Okay, so there is a fairly large impact. Okay, even if I make a reasonable assumption. Okay, and if I make a large impact assumption, which I don't think, is something which we can do right away. We have to watch what happens in the US. But if we make a significant impact assumption, then the GDP is bound to decline by, let's say, between 9 and 13%. Okay, I've got 12.9, but in all these kind of exercises, there is a certain degree of error, and assumption that you make. I've tried to cross-check with other multipliers and so on. It's roughly corroborates, though my multipliers are different, somewhat, than what the NIPFP, for instance, has come out with, not in this context, but in a general context of understanding the multiplier. So, so what is required is a fairly large fiscal stimulus. Okay, and what would this amount to? Government expenditures rise by about 15% higher than what they are currently. Okay, investments actually largely on the shoulders of government. Okay, it goes again, it rises by 15%. Okay, now obviously the private sector investment would have been crunched. So the government has to spend on public investment at least 20% more, if not higher. Okay, and similarly, there is a massive kind of support to consumers in the form of a consumption support of around 20 lakh crores, and that will bring the economy back to about 2.67%. Okay, now this is what one would have to do if there are no tax cuts. Okay. However, tax cuts can have a very interesting example, a very interesting impact. So using tax cuts, if the GST rate is reduced to about 80% of its current level, let's say, not really across the board, but more efficiently done, okay, but which amounts to an 80% cut across, seemingly across the board, then you can actually restore the growth back to about 5%, even with only a consumption support of 10 lakh crores. Okay. Now this is important because, you know, a significant impact versus a modest impact is actually based largely on what would happen given the lockouts and the continuing lockouts. Okay. So if I feed the kind of information which is available on migrants and put together the unemployment information from the CMI, the decline in the, you know, in the labor participation rates and so on, essentially it will knock out, because of the disruption and autonomous consumption of around 100 lakh crores. And therefore, you know, you have to really plan for it. Okay. I would guess that, you know, at least a third of it has already happened. Okay. Because of these 2 months of lockout, maybe a fourth of it has already happened because of this lack. So I would think that it's possible to bring back, but it would require a Keynesian type demand side model with multipliers. Okay. And yeah, so this is what it would require. Okay. So of course, quick comments. I can elaborate on this if there are questions. Most are credit enhancement measures that the government has announced. Okay. In itself, they are not going to be they are not going to work in themselves. They could do a bit of holdout for the companies which would otherwise sink, but they are limited because the demand side measures must kind of come in. And other enablers, you know, like perhaps the most stupidest ways of locking out needs to simply go. Okay, we need to go to a functional restriction from lockouts. You know, the word lockout should be banned. It doesn't serve any purpose. Okay. See, bond yields have fallen, but not significantly. Yeah. So massive increase in unemployment, fall in labor force seeking NREGS. Okay, already I've told you much larger response is required. You know, no way but to monetize the expenditure, monetize the additional expenditure. Now there is a mistaken belief that there is no fiscal space. Okay. That's purely mistaken because it's based on a family budget model. Okay. It's like pretending as if the government is another simple element like you and me in the system. That is not so. Okay. It was never so. Okay. Uncertainty and demand for liquidity is not recognized. Now, the one thing sure about a modern economy is the portfolio demand for money skyrockets whenever there is an uncertainty. And you have to deal with ways to handle it. In the early days, you can handle it by curtailing it and doing other measures, you know, like actually you know, reducing rates and talking and so on. But once it's deeply entrenched, okay, you have to deal the liquidity. Even that may not work to revive the economy, but at least it will stop the collapse. Okay. Now, Make in India, I would say that, look, you know, the Make in India, there is nothing really on the cards, although there are, you know, I mean, strong willingness to do things about it. However, the intellectual basis for putting together a Make in India doesn't seem to be on at all. And I don't think anybody in the kind of periphery of the government is recognizing what we need to do, which is essentially, you know, go back to what the East Asians did in the current context. Okay. I'll come to it if there are questions. Now, of course, one weakness of the government has been combining reforms or structural reforms with stabilization. Now, I think it's very important. When you do stabilization, okay, there is both opportunity to delay structural reforms and to do certain kinds of structural reforms. Okay. When you do structural reforms, if they're not linked with the macroeconomic side, then it could be counterproductive. In fact, those reforms may just fall on a dead body. Okay. Now, agricultural structural reforms have been long overdue. There is indication that, you know, quite a bit is going to happen. One hopes that the land announcement will also free land for leasing without risk of title to all kinds of farmers to do it. If that also comes through with these measures, if they're seriously intended, I think, you know, we have a deal on agriculture. So that's something very, very positive. Very large support for consumption would be required if we keep going forward. However, at this stage, a tax cut would work wonderfully. Okay. Now, of course, I leave the last question. Why is the government, so why doesn't it see reason? Are we to expect, maybe it has seen reason, are we to expect a real response in a month or two down the line? These are the kind of questions which I also have to have in mind. So I'll stop here and invite questions from your side. Okay, as I said, I'll speak for only half an hour. Okay. Yeah.
Submission, there are many questions both on YouTube as well as chat box.
Yeah.
So,
just read them to me.
Yeah, I will read them for you. I will read few questions at a time.
Yeah.
So Manas on YouTube asks that 45 lakhs MSMEs to 4 lakh crores MSMEs, average per MSME, is it enough? So basically, is he saying that is the amount given for MSMEs enough or is it less? That's a question related to MSME.
Yeah.
And someone has asked somewhere that you are giving money to MSMEs, but if it doesn't reach labor, is it going to benefit? So I think these are two questions related to MSMEs. I will look for further also. A few further questions also, but these two you can answer maybe.
Yeah, okay, so these are fair questions. In a sense, I have already addressed that. See, there is often complementarity. In a kind of a deep situation like this, there is complementarity which is required. Because you see, there is both a supply side problem, a demand side problem, and as a result of all of it, a payments mechanism problem. Okay, that means the financial sector, which allows transactions, is itself problematic because now you trust each other less because you believe that somebody else may become insolvent and so on. So there is a three-sided problem. So therefore, simultaneous, coordinated, and strategic measures are called for. Strategic in the sense that they are integrated. That is what is missing. I mean, if you just provide credit while the demand is sinking, or while there is a kind of capacity loss which is happening, okay, then you are in a situation where you're further and further going to go into the abyss, and only from the collapse something can come. But as I said, this is better than nothing, because one hopes that the other measures would come, particularly the demand boosting measures would come. Okay. Now on the labor side, yeah, I mean, I would agree, and here I'm repeating something which I have often heard, okay, coming from left wing and others. See, there is nothing intrinsically bad about an idea that why don't we use the large buffer stocks to at least ensure that nobody would be hungry. Okay. Now, the realistic cost of that, given that a third of these buffer stocks are anyway destined for the rats, okay, is going to be very low. Okay. So this kind of what I think 5 kg of rice for some migrant workers and all that, it's like it's like peanuts. When there is such an easy opportunity to simply say that, hey, NGOs, hey, government, officials and so on, come start food for work kitchen programs at the work sites, issue rations, cook at home, do all of that and do this very liberally. Okay, and do it only on those commodities which are available with the government. Okay, and do it even including those quality. People will crib, but they'll also find a way out of it. Now, what this does is that their spending, therefore, on FMCG will not collapse altogether. Okay, and therefore it will give a demand boost. And remember the number of MSMEs and others who are into this space. Okay, now it's actually the other thing I'll say is that let's look at it in terms of interaction and integration. Measures for MSMEs alone, while measures for MSMEs are warranted and they're good, many large firms would also find it very difficult. And remember, a lot of MSMEs are in vendor relationship with the large. Now, if you do it in a way that you put a double squeeze on the large, they are not going to respond because they have hold out. They can hold out, okay, which will actually damage the MSMEs and damage consumer sentiments and so on. So the integrated aspect, you don't do this. So you do and work it through leverage points for change in society. Okay. So in short, governments must think in terms of policy rather than pretend to get into the shoes of bankers and MSMEs, which is what they are doing. Okay. Now, this is a particular penchant of the government of India that, people who should be thinking in terms of policy, they think as if they are action people, and people who should be acting, they probably think in policy? I don't know. So even Indian industry is unable to translate its demands into policies. Okay. In some cases they do, such as the automobile tax cuts, but that is mistakenly taken to be something which is a pure private interest. It is not, because automobiles have a very, very high price elasticity of demand. And my sense is with a 40% reduction in excise duty, let's say halving of excise duty, okay, to be simple, that is the GST, and the auto demand will pick up. I'll come back to it in a little moment. Yeah. So are there other questions?
Yes, Sebastian, there are not many questions related to China, competitiveness of India, shifting of business from China to India, incentives by government and all. So maybe all of that you can take in one go.
Yeah. Okay. So this China, India, and remember, the Indian middle class kind of alternates between fear when they lock themselves up and hope when they see, hey, the whole world will drop in here because China has become a bad boy. Okay. Now let's recognize the facts. China has revived itself much faster, okay, and than any country in the world. So all countries which refuse to deal with China would be hurting themselves. And I don't believe that countries, even the US included, are that masochistic. They might be sadistic. So they will come back and deal with China in a very big way. Okay. However, over the longer period, India has an advantage. There is nothing, immediately that you can grab because our response is going to be much slower. Part of it is inevitable because we are a democracy. So let's be honest, even the US response is going to be smaller in that sense. But in the longer run, I'm sure there would be some shift from China. Okay. But, let's look at it more honestly. We have been talking about make in India, manufacturing in India, not just this government, but even the previous government. But look at the complete angularity between macroeconomic interest rate, credit, and other policies. As a good example, on electronics, the bound tariffs on mobile phones and laptops and flat screen television, which constitute the bulk of electronic imports, has been near 0 or 5%. Okay, because India, looking in the rear view mirror, bound these at these low rates long ago. And we never had the sense to go and open them up. Okay. Same was the case with solar panels. Okay. And what happened? The government tried to use the government procurement route to reserve solar panels for India, which of course China was flooding, okay, Indian markets. And what happened? The case got rejected thrice in the WTO. The panel just rejected it. Okay. But the government of India kept going back, as if you're above the laws of the world. Okay, so it's a complete shame that we ended up doing this. So why aren't the bound tariffs renegotiated and raised to high levels? Trump's bulldozing China provided an opportunity for government of India to raise tariffs to about 12.5%. But 12.5% is not going to create a revolution in electronics assembly. A revolution in electronics assembly you can actually create by having a bound tariff for fully assembled ones, giving near 0 tariff for CKD and substantially made products in India, and then creating a good tariff for components as we go along, but not immediately. Okay. So that if assembly of 100,000 crores worth of electronic equipment happen in India, okay, the entire lot of component manufacturers will come to India. We can use this. In fact, this is exactly what China did some 15 years ago. Okay. So those kind of strategic initiatives are not there. The government is kind of caught in just one framework. Ease of doing business is everything. Okay. So I make it easier and easier and easier. In that process, the laws of economics, of tariffs and so on are being completely. Okay. So hence, I'm very skeptical about being able to through these measures, things from China. However, if we strategically get it right, okay, namely, if we are able to bring down the exchange rate, not because the market knocks you down, but because you strategically underprice your currency, bring down the interest rates, okay, and also work on the tariffs in a very interesting way, okay, which is sequenced and strategic, okay, then actually there is no stopping the country. But what I'm saying is, just the middle class, just wants to hear good things so that it feels good. No, that's not going to work. Okay. Yeah. So any other question?
Yeah, definitely there are many questions. So there are questions related to GST, and there is one question specific that government is trying to work on the supply side, but what about the demand side? So related to GST also, that there is a question which says that now that government is reducing or companies are reducing the salaries or payments to employees, the demand would go down. So all these are related questions.
Yeah, okay. So good you raised this, because I wanted to spend a little bit more time on the GST. You see, if you look at the GST rates, they have been a pure, what I would say, isomorphically mapped from the original excise, sales tax rates, etc. onto GST. Okay. There's hardly any change. Now, there's nothing that tells you that those rates have been rational. The only rationality, there's only one element of rationality, is that those items of mass consumption, such as raw food, have been kept very low. Okay, which I don't think is irrational, which I think is fine. However, the rates on all other products could be as far from revenue maximization if you think the product is a sin product. Okay. Now, the problem with sin products in India, which are really hurtful, is you don't want to go for a revenue maximizing tariff. You want to go for a killing tariff, okay, which is the killing rate, which would be the case for cigarettes, which is fine. However, for alcohol, do you want to have a killing rate? I don't think so. Okay. At least those states which are liberal could go for a revenue maximizing tariff. So one thing which is missing is the revenue maximization in the case of sin products. Now come to the other non-sin products. Okay, they are not necessarily tariffs which are optimal. Okay, take for instance an auto. I'm not so sure that currently what the government collects by way of auto is the maximum it can collect, because if it actually reduces the rate, the demand could be much higher and it could collect more. Having said that, but that's something which we should have experimented with and done studies and figured out. But right now there is a great opportunity to use the auto sector. See, why am I talking about the auto sector? The auto sector, with its two-level input-output linkages, okay, constitute as much as 40 to 45% of Indian manufacturing. Because we have ensured that besides auto and chemical, and rather drugs and pharmaceutical, there's very little else in the economy. Okay. So the input-output linkages, are quite significant, and therefore they grab something like 40 to 45%, I guess, of the manufacturing sector. Okay. And I would think that the demands can be made very price elastic in the following way. So one of the things that I would like to suggest is the following: and a kind of consumption or a purchase tax offset. Okay, just like an investment tax credit, which has been widely used in the US. Of course, these things are hardly known, I don't know, in policy circles in India. But what I would say is a purchase tax credit. Now, what do I mean by that? Okay, let's say in the next 1 year you purchase a car. Let's say the excise duty was 18%. I now say that if you purchase it in 1 year, you will pay an excise duty which is 30% of that. That means you'll pay, instead of 18%, you'll pay 30% of that, that's 6% duty. So buy an SUV or buy a car at 18% duty effectively, which is claimed to be 18%, at let us say 6% duty, as long as you do it in 1 year. What will happen? Discretionary consumption, and it's very important that this is discretionary, gets crowded in today. And if that happens, the demand side gets blown. And I think that's going to be very, very efficient. Okay. So if you really want a change of that kind, this is the way forward. Okay. So you must recognize the demand elasticities, the price sensitivity of demand and the income elasticities of demand. Government of India's approach right from history has been to completely ignore it. We pushed the railways, for instance, to a freight tariff by which all the freight was on the roads, pound on the trucks, pounding the roads, while the freight carriage by the railways was much lower than what could have been. So what was the net result? Even without the Chinese railways carried 8 times more freight than did the Indian railways, because you kicked out the entire freight and you were carrying the things that you should not be carrying, namely medium distance passenger. Okay? You're not pandering, you're not catering to the real efficiency of the railways, the real comparative advantage of the railways, more correctly. Okay? So this has been a disease, and I'm sure if you examine product by product, you can find various ways where the emotive element, gets in. Arey, car luxury hai, so, usko jada se jada duty. SUV ko, 28% dal do. Given the demand side in SUV, if you reduce the duty to maybe 15%, you'll actually collect more money on SUVs. Okay, so this is something which completely misses this linear accountants, khata wala thinking, which is part of the government of India today. Okay, so one needs to get out of this khata wala thinking. Okay? Yeah, any other question?
What time you have to go? You tell me. I have a lot of questions.
Yeah, okay. Let's have your question, Sanjay.
Okay. So, I have questions from participants.
Yeah.
There are questions related to labor migration, all those labor problems that have emerged in recent past, maybe last 15, 20 days. And therefore, what will the impact of that in near future and long future? And impact, therefore, on industry also and whatever. For example, if yesterday there were no labor in the market even when shops opened. So, how will companies be able to work?
Yeah, good question. See, suddenly this labor issue has hit all of us. Okay, and let me say that, while one could anticipate some part of it, some of the other things I didn't know. Okay, so what is this labor issue? Okay, the labor issue is that a large part of the labor force is actually migrant. Okay, my good friend Professor Chinmaya Tubbe, who has a wonderful book, I think those who are interested in migrant labor should pick up his book and go through that. It's the first book, and I think it's remarkably, appropriate to.
I should invite him. I am planning to invite him.
Yeah. So, so I've learned a great deal from there. Now, the point I'm trying to make is that, look, Indian labor, why did this extraordinary, movement within the country happen? I would guess two reasons. One is quite significant differences in the demand side and in the labor and in the wage rates. Some caused by a reservation wage going up, like in Kerala. Others caused by a demand for industrial labor and urban labor, like in Gujarat, Maharashtra, and the production states and so on. So these were the two factors. However, implicitly, I think there is a third factor. Okay. See, labor laws were bypassed in three ways. Okay. One is using Tempes, that is contract labor. The other is by using contract labor is one. The other is by outsourcing. And the third one, which kind of overlies both, is by using migrant labor. Because remember, migrant labor have absolutely no rights. They are treated worse than animals, I would guess. I mean, a local cow would have better protection than a migrant labor in India. Okay, there's no doubt about it. Okay, so till they settle down, and a lot of migration in India is of this kind, which is purely labor seeking, for the fact that the women don't move, unless there is a settlement which happens much later, maybe after 5-6 years, the women move. Okay, so it's not a very healthy migration. Okay, it reflects the weaknesses of states like Bihar, Orissa, Bengal, and so on, in having done absolutely nothing to have an engine of growth. Okay, correct. At least Kerala did not. Kerala also never had an engine of growth, but it had a high reservation rate due to the Gulf side. So they are no model either. Okay, and so therefore this huge labor issue has come up. Okay, now this has been revealed in a very significant way. So people who should be knowing, I mean, some industry leaders from, let's say, Jharkhand, for instance, called me up and said, "Hey, we didn't know that there were 20 lakh Jharkhand workers in outside, and now we know." Okay, so you can imagine, what kind of perspective the government would have, because it was completely unseen. Okay, and many of us middle class who are busy locking ourselves up and closing the doors also don't see it. So there is a complete coherence in a middle class government's actions and in what we think. Okay, so the one set of people who have been really, really hurt are the migrant labor. Okay, the human side of the tragedy is enormous, and these are not beggars or anything. These are people who work very hard. Many of them actually reasonably well educated. Quite a few of them semi-skilled or skilled. Okay, and very few of them actually that unskilled that they are just picking stones and throwing them or something. Okay, so so now what happens? These guys have been demoralized. They've gone back. Hopefully, if the revival happens, they'll all come back. Okay, But some of those baby steps, both in the right direction and in the wrong direction, which this government is seeking, kind of points to the need for more comprehensive idea of India. Okay? India will have a lot of migration. However, the big states like Bihar cannot afford not to have their own local engines of growth. Okay? You can't just send all your people to Kerala or Gujarat. So this regional development issue, that regionally we can't have these extremes of development, would be highlighted. I think that's the long-term picture. And of course, the strategic thing is that India's development process has to be labor intensive in design, in strategy. And unless it is, there is no demand side consistency, and therefore you're not going to grow. So willy-nilly, you'll be forced to go for labor intensive, approaches. It doesn't mean putting restrictions on producers, saying use this technology or use that. It simply means that going for massively expansionary and ambitious policies of demand management, of export-led growth, undervaluing the currency, low interest rates, so that the growth rate gets pushed up to about 10%. Because today talking about it seems like, a dream. Right now it's a dream, but it wasn't a dream, 5 years back. We brought it down to the state because the Indian economy, remember, willy-nilly, not because it was intended, but because certain things happened, actually grew at around 9%, maybe 8.5% for as long as 6 years. And sometimes, climbing up to 9.75 during the period, the 5 years before the global financial crisis. Okay, and that was knocked off by the central bank because he never believed that a growth of that high is possible. Okay, he had to upgrade the targets every year. Okay, and he responded by cutting because he saw high inflation and he cut the supply side, cut the demand. Now, actually, there is also an RBI side problem to achieving any high growth in India. So the moment they see an inflation, they are going to knock it off, irrespective of whether it's a supply side inflation, even if it's a pure food inflation, which ideally should be managed by rationing, or even if it's only an onion inflation. Okay? They are hardwired on it. Now, the contrast with China is very important. China saw very, very high inflation. Okay, from 79, actually from around 81, 82, all the way to 88. And this was a pure supply side inflation caused by food demand in the face of food output actually rising. So what they did is they understood it, they let it pass. They understood it as a supply side inflation, not to be attacked by demand side measures. But this strategic vision is not there because, most of our academia are also textbook trained, and the moment they see an inflation, they'll not get under it and see whether inflation is caused by onions. So in India, inflation is caused by onions, which I told you, in my last presentation where I presented the graph of fruits, vegetables, and inflation. That's it. So this inflation hangover is again coming from the middle class and the pandering to the weak and knee-jerk understanding of the middle class. Yeah. Any other?
Sebastian, there are questions related to banking, related to NPAs, impact of COVID on banks. So all questions related to banking, maybe you can answer on one go. And one on, is it the right time to start a new business? These two questions, and then maybe I will allow you to go.
Maybe the last question I can answer better. Huh? So which business? If you want to start fine dining, I would think no. Unless, I'm still not ruling out, unless you can, create some innovation, okay, by which, let us say, you have some kind of a wind trail, air curtains which protect each other. If you have a ring of an air curtain which protects every diner, let's say a table with an air curtain around it, because I'm sure there'll be, I'm just joking, but technological change and anticipating would be a great thing for a startup or for a business.
Sebastian, one person on YouTube, I missed the name, the fonts are small, has said that Chandra says that, demand of automobile may increase actually because people would like to travel solo and avoid public transport. So
yeah, I would think that has some merit. Okay, that has some merit. But the question is, would the affordability be also there in a situation of falling?
So maybe small car business may rise again. Nano may have future.
Yeah, see, if you can steer the economy back to, let us say, growth of -2% or something, I would think that could be a possibility. But the point is, if you know for sure that it's going to collapse to minus 10%, okay, at the very least, given the intensity of the COVID crisis and our own, I would say ham-handed response during the lockdowns, okay, which needs the lockdown to be extended, you need solid measures. Okay, you need solid measures. Okay? And what is the harm in giving up a bit of excise? I mean, after all, the government can raise a lot more resources than what it currently does. Okay? And you can put it all down on paper and see how much it is. So, my modest measure would raise the fiscal deficit to about 5.5%, 6% of GDP. So if it can go up to about 7%, then you can win the game, very clearly with whatever the nature of the COVID crisis. So my point is, yes, I mean, I agree with you that demand patterns are going to shift quite dramatically. Okay.
Banking?
Yeah, on the banking side, on the banking, NPAs and so on. See, I would beg you to recognize that there is a kind of feedback mechanism to the whole thing. Okay? That bad macroeconomic management slows down growth, can slow down growth, which can amplify or which can lead to an NPA problem. Similarly, bad lending practices can result in poor lending, high NPAs, freeze on lending, freeze on the banking sector, and therefore to a payments kind of credit crisis or a payments crisis, and therefore lead to, a poorer economy which then compounds. So there is this kind of, feedback which is amplificatory in nature.
Question, there are questions related to travel,
And
tourism,
therefore,
hospitality.
any question on NPAs has to be moderated by this understanding. And my understanding is that, look, if we had attacked the NPA crisis early on, okay, the banking system would have had far better scope to lend today, but we didn't do that. Okay. The details are, of course, there. Much talked about allowing many of the NBFCs to just collapse, creating complete uncertainty in the market by letting some banks just fall flat, holding back deposits of people. Now these are all very important because they spew uncertainty, and when there is uncertainty, everybody keeps more cash, therefore requiring actually the banks to be much more liberal. So, yeah.
So future of travel, tourism, hospitality industries.
My guess is as good as yours. Okay. So let me not talk about it. Okay. Yeah. Anything else?
I think Sebastian, you have taken most of the questions. There are many, many, many more, but you have a class. We'll maybe sometime else later we'll revisit and see these.
Yeah, there is a question which is coming up directly. Yeah, I mean, direct cash to labor, sure. In fact, direct cash to labor at the workplace would be wonderful, even if they're staying idle. So that when the work starts, they are there and available. And it will also subsidize the employer to, continue to hold on to labor instead of throwing them out. See, now, remember the Supreme Court, I think was it yesterday, has objected to the government's ruling that, look, the executive order passed by the government that you can't throw out labor has been challenged in the Supreme Court. And my guess, I've not seen the judgment, but the Supreme Court has apparently ruled that, that's not all. You can throw out people because it takes away the right of business. Okay. Now, if that is the case, and if the COVID crisis and the continuing stalemate kind of continues, and the government is frightened into, or it's too khata oriented to come out with a real fiscal boost, and it continues to kind of fool around by talking about credit as if they are fiscal expenditures and other measures which are comfort creating, or policy as credit measures and so on, as fiscal measures, and you deepen it, people are going to get through. Okay, it's a gap to step on. Okay. Now the middle class can go back and sit comfortably because they're not going to get thrown out, would be their condition. But I beg to differ. Soon enough, you IT guys, middle class guys who have the jobs, wake up, you'll be thrown out. Okay. Raise your voices so that the spending actually happens and the economy revives. Okay. Just using silly arguments like, look, kuch to life save ho gaya hai with this lockdowns, is no argument. I think right away you need the lockdowns to be lifted completely with only restrictions being in place. So it's not the other way around that you selectively lift the lockdowns, because no selective lifting of the lockdown will allow the integrated production chains to get energized. Okay? And nobody is going to rechain it for a short period. So therefore, inevitably, you are going to sink. Okay. Yeah.
So there is one question. Can government encourage long-term deposits with tax exemptions and high interest rates payable at the time of maturity to support banks?
See, okay, now, this is again a problem, because think it through. We are not talking about savings. We are not talking about flows of resources, financial resources, and so on. That doesn't help, because right now the situation is where the spending needs to be revived, and the product and the shops and the factories need to open. Okay. Now, what you're talking about is a financial aspect of spending. That means when you say investment, we loosely use the term as if you're spending. You're not. It's the companies which do the spending when they buy capital goods. Okay. When you invest in a company, you're not spending. You're just giving it on loan to the company. So what India requires today is spending, and the most basic, the empirically most sound macroeconomics tells you that unless the spending goes up, economy will not revive. And of course, economists can differ on how the spending needs to be pushed up, or why, whether you need to do it. But all are agreed that the spending has to go up, otherwise the economy cannot revive. Okay. They're Keynesians, monetarists, nobody can differ.
Yeah. So last question.
Okay.
Is where will 20 lakh crore come from? And then you can.
Again, this is a standard question which happens and which is going to happen in the mind. See, it simply means that the fiscal deficit as a percentage of GDP, past GDP, goes up to maybe about 7 or 8%. I'm not exactly sure about the calculations. Okay. Now, what is wrong with a 7 or 8% fiscal deficit for a while? Remember, we had a fiscal deficit of close to 8.5% on the eve of Narasimha Rao's reforms. And then we brought it down all the way to about 3.5%. So a temporary interlude where the fiscal deficit can go up as high as 7.5% is perfectly all right. It's only, people who can't see the macro aspect of macroeconomics, but to kind of convert macroeconomics into micro into a number of people who lose this game. Okay. And most importantly today, if the interest rates can be brought down to about 2% on government bonds, the government's cost of borrowing would be very low. So all that the government would need to do, it doesn't need to force the RBI to buy it. If the RBI reduces the interest rate and keeps the interest rate at 2% through both a repo and OMO, okay, government can borrow heavily, in fact, much, much more than what we have anticipated, and do the stimulus. Okay, would it be inflationary? No, because the standard model, which tells us everything, tells you that unless the demand side exceeds the full employment level of output, the inflationary pressures will not be there. Okay. So it's a wrong reading that if the fiscal deficit goes up, the inflation should go up. Yes, it would go up in certain kinds of situations. That doesn't mean that in all situations. So recognize that difference. And I'm kind of asking over and over again that there is a macro to macro, which many macro economists don't recognize, and that's part of the tragedy. Okay,
okay, thanks, Abhistan. Thanks a lot.
Okay, thanks,
once again. Thank you.
Yeah, let's hope that the government in about a month's time, comes out with a really nice fiscal push, as well as comes out with measures against the worker in favor of the workers. And so. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Thanks to all of you.
Thanks.
Thank you. And we'll have another talk next week.
Yeah.
Thanks a lot.